Architect Rem Koolhaas is here. His many projects include the Kunsthal in Rotterdam, the Guggenheim in Las Vegas, and the Prada store here in New York. In the year 2000, he was awarded the Pritzker Architecture Prize. It is the most prestigious prize an architect can receive. He recently guest edited a special issue of Wired magazine, which will be released on May 12th. I am pleased to have him back at this table. I'll just show you a couple of things. This is the Wired magazine. Guest editor Rem Koolhaas presents the ultimate atlas for the 21st century. We'll talk about that. There is also this, which is about Europe and the European Union. We'll talk about that. But first, there was a story in the New York Times in which it said that because of the Whitney was not going to go ahead with a project that you had designed, because of the Los Angeles County Museum and a series of other things where people were pulling back, that you were leaving New York. You immediately stepped forward to say, I'm committed to New York. It's part of my mental mindset.
Yeah.
Map, right.
I've been in New York since '72, and I intend to kind of stay till in New York till death do us part.
Yes.
And
so you're married to New York.
I'm not married to New York, but New York is one of the critical poles of Western civilization, and we have an office here and we have work here, and that's why I'm absolutely committed to stay here.
But did you say that New York, for example, in a speech at Columbia, that New York was not responsive to the challenge of Rem Koolhaas?
No.
Did you say anything like that?
No.
I saw reported.
No. On the contrary, we have been over the past couple of years been really extremely hardworking in trying to realize buildings in New York, and so far the only building that we've succeeded is the Prada building.
Right.
But as you know, we did a hotel for Ian Schrager with the Swiss architects Herzog and de Moron, and we did a kind of project for the Whitney, and I think...
Yeah, but these are things that there have been some question about one or the other.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so ultimately I think that September 11 changed everything for so many people, and I think that ultimately that is the reason why ambition became different in America, priorities became different in America, and so those projects are definitely not happening. But we have other projects to do here, and we will have other projects to do here.
You've got one in Seattle, the library. You got to finish that, right?
We are finishing the library in Seattle, and it will be open in February next year. I think it will be really sensational. We are finishing a building for the student union at IIT in Chicago.
Right.
We are doing another Prada store in LA.
You are going to do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You are also building a communications center in Beijing?
Yeah.
Or not?
I mean, we are kind of actually in a kind of really interesting moment in our life. We had incredible emphasis on New York for 5 years, on America for 5 years. And what we decided to do after September 11, when we realized that things were going to be different in America, to also orient ourselves eastward. And we have now been working on projects in St. Petersburg. We are doing the Hermitage there. And we have recently won a competition for the headquarters of CCTV, which is the big Chinese state television in Beijing. And that's what we are building. Which is a kind of huge building which needs to be finished in 2007.
Tell me how you feel, and I'm asking you your sense. I mean, you wrote a famous book about New York City. Tell me how you feel about America in a post-9/11 environment.
Well, that's an incredibly complex question, of course. And actually, in a Wired article, I have written a kind of postscript to Delirious New York,
right.
Which where really plot, what happened to New York since '72 when the Trade Center was built, and what happened through the mayor coach to Giuliani, and ultimately with 2001. And I think that it's been a series of events that I think in a very deep way has changed the nature of New York. And
in what way?
Well, I think already before September 11, there was something going on where New York was a very brutal but deeply intellectually exciting city. You remember the 70s, when Warhol was here, it was really a city where anything could happen and where good and bad happened. And I think that since Reagan and since Giuliani, the city became, in a way, better organized, straighter, and that kind of some of the potential of the city in terms of ideas, in terms of imagination, in terms of extremes, became a little bit flatter and a little bit more predictable. It was a city that in the 70s was almost anti-materialist. It was kind of really poor, almost bankrupt, and in the 80s and 90s, it became kind of more and more garish and consumer-oriented. And I think that since September 11, and by the way, I was in New York at September 11, so I experienced the incredible moment afterwards where there seemed to be an incredible tenderness between people and a real generosity between people. But what you have seen since then is that there has been a kind of obsession, or at least in my mind, with commemorating the event, and what I would have thought would have been much more exciting ultimately for the city if September 11 had been the beginning of a rethinking of the city, or a beginning of the redefining of the city. So I think that if you look at American history, if you look, for instance, at what happened to Chicago after it was burned, or to San Francisco after the earthquake, enormous catastrophes, that the disasters were turned into energies, how the cities could be redefined, rebuilt, and improved. And I think that could have happened in New York, but I haven't seen it happen so far.
Okay, but then why don't you think it happened, is the question. And what is it, give me a sense of the vision. First, why it didn't happen, and what might have happened that would have been taken us to a different place.
I think that what was so beautiful in New York after September 11, that you had a sense that really New Yorkers among themselves were defining what this event was about, and that it had an incredible impact on the sensibility and the sensitivities of the city. It made the city obviously much more vulnerable, but there was also perhaps a kind of new intelligence, what the city could be. And I think that since then it has been increasingly, the event has been mobilized in a kind of vast political story, and I think that that is part of the discrepancy. It could have gone in terms of what does it really mean for New York, and what can New York do with it. And I think it did go in the direction, what does this mean to America, and how does America have to react? So I think that it's a difference between a New York event and an American event.
Okay, let me look specifically at this competition to redesign downtown. My impression is that you don't think much of it.
I think that the competition, I mean, we were actually in a kind of really interesting moment early last year, where we had to choose ourselves whether we would be participating in that one, or whether we would kind of work on this event in Beijing. And my judgment was that at this point in New York, there was such a stringent obligation of memorizing the event, while in Beijing there was really the possibility of defining a new culture or intervening in a culture in the making. And therefore our instinct went for participating in that adventure rather than the New York adventure. That said, I think that the way Libeskind took this issue, made it his own, and with an almost diabolical efficiency, turned it into his project, is totally impressive. And actually impressive. Yeah, impressive.
So you're admiring of the way he, not only of the way he won the approval.
Absolutely.
Of the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation.
I think it was a vast...
Or the governor and the mayor, at least.
It was obviously an enormous campaign, an incredible strategy.
But are you damning with faint praise, to use an American expression which you were familiar with, which is you admire the lobbying, but you don't necessarily praise the design itself?
I think that would be totally premature, because the design, I think, is in evolution. And
that surely is true.
Yeah. And actually, I really admire the whole effort, and the precision of the effort. I mean, you don't kind of realize to what extent all architects are involved in incredibly difficult choices and have to be kind of very political, and that designing something is only a kind of fragment of the overall effort.
Would you have been capable of doing that?
I've done it in my time, of course, but I think it really demands a cause, and it demands a complete commitment to a cause. And in this case, it would have been difficult for me simply because I'm so directed toward the future and not toward the past. But I think that the way Libeskind did it is utterly impressive. And I'm sincere. I mean, I'm not being,
I take that word for
sarcastic.
you. Yeah. And whether you like the design or not, you think is irrelevant right now because it's immaterial. All right. Let me turn to this, and we may come back to some of these things. Tell me what this is.
Well, this is.
You just told me about this today, so I didn't know about it. So I'm not well informed about it.
This is a kind of project which we did 2 years ago for the European Union. And it was a kind of project where we worked with them and for them, and where we started to speculate how the idea of European Union could be represented in a more attractive and a more compelling way, and how the European Union could represent itself in a way that had more impact.
So how do you give meaning to the idea of the European Union?
Yes.
How do you give visualization?
Exactly, visualization, and for instance, the European Union is now housed in Brussels. It is housed in developer buildings. Its headquarters is a totally anonymous building. It has not had any effort or any influence on the way it is housed. And of course, it has to compete on the one hand with America, with its White House, its capital, and the whole of Washington, which is one political emblem. It has to compete with the Kremlin, which is a political emblem, with Beijing, the Forbidden City. And what we have is a series of mediocre buildings.
Yeah.
And,
it's true.
And buildings that have no character. And at the same time, the European Union has represented itself always as Europe is becoming more united and therefore more blue, because that is the color of Europe. But actually, what is unique about Europe is that a whole series of cultures that are totally different, that have vast differences between themselves, have decided to cooperate within a certain framework. So it's not a united Europe, and it never wanted to be. And I think that therefore what we try to...
It never wanted to be.
It wanted to collaborate. It's a kind of series of entities that want to collaborate, but they don't want to be a kind of single thing. They don't want to be kind of
they don't want to give up their own sense
their
of
own idiosyncrasies,
cultural sovereignty.
That is part of it, but also, there are 24 languages alone. So it can never be as homogeneous as some of the other.
You can create a common currency, but not a common language.
Exactly, and so therefore, what we wanted to do for them is to reassure them that to be insistent on diversity, to insist on difference, could still be compatible with the idea of forming a single larger entity that is connected by laws and by agreements and by pacts, kind of, rather than forming a homogeneous bloc.
From a political standpoint, what is your own sort of commitment to the idea of Europe?
Well, I think that through September 11, we became, in a certain way, more emphatically European or more consciously European. I think that one of the unfortunate effects of September 11 is, of course, a kind of vast polarization. And in that polarization, we felt that Europe needed a better articulation of its kind of position.
Yeah, I agree with you. There was a lost opportunity. After 9/11, there was a lost opportunity. In the beginning, we all remember the moment there was the great headline, "We're all Americans," which was in a French newspaper. The interesting thing is that many people believe that something happened and got lost. For whatever reason, it got lost. Whether some people thought America was becoming more unilateralist or not is one idea. Another idea is that Europe never understood 9/11. There are many people will say to you, and I've been on both sides of the Atlantic, had lots of conversations about this, that America has been at war since September the 11th, a war that Europe never was involved in.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a basic difference. They don't see the world alike anymore.
No.
All that, now, many people want to bind it back and want to find ways and have conferences and meetings and discussions and books and articles and, you go to a bookstore in Paris and half of the books in the window about America.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that in a way there has been, maybe you can call it a kind of trivialization of the whole issue, and a kind of very unhealthy obsession with America in Europe. And I think that is, for a better word, and I think that is why it is interesting for Europe now to look, at states like Russia, at states like China, where there is still an enormous interest in forming a world together.
Okay, but for what purpose? I mean, that's a fascinating idea, is that Europe should find more common ground with Russia and China than with the United States. Do you believe that as a political idea?
Not so much as a political idea, but I think that's there is a kind of interesting sense at the moment, and you should look at the first anti-globalization protests were there, and then that was a group of predominantly younger people who were against globalization. But I think that if you look at what has happened in the UN, etc., you see also that suddenly the forces of governments also turned against globalization and also turned against this kind of notion that no matter how unwieldy, it was still interesting to find a kind of system of pacts and agreements where people would ultimately not so much agree but organize their own coexistence. And I think that to the extent that America feels that it has other priorities right now, and that may be totally legitimate, I think for that reason it's more interesting for Europe to obsess about America it's more interesting for Europe not to obsess about America, but to see, how they can stitch together these other people that are still interested in pursuing it.
Okay, but are you saying two things? One, are you saying that Europe ought to find new allies so that it can challenge America?
I don't think so. It's a matter of challenging. I think it's a matter of
Competing?
Keeping things together, basically. I think that, but I mean, this is maybe really too political in the sense that I'm ultimately an architect, but we got in this work simply to help the Europeans to define themselves, and to be intelligent about their associations. For instance, this
go ahead. Well, let me show you this first. Just explain to me what this means. This is the great arc, the arches of
Well, there is,
McDonald.
of course, the McDonald arc, and it's ubiquitous, and everyone knows what it means. And
Right.
Europe is totally missing such a kind of entity. So if you turn it 90 degrees, it could be an emblem of Europe, and we are kind of just using that as a kind of prototype.
Oh, I see. This could be the European emblem right here.
It could be Europe. Yeah. So
It's actually not bad, is
it's
it?
about how easy it would be. How easy it would be to generate a kind of common understanding of the same of what Europe is. And
Pretty smart, Rem. Pretty smart.
and here we are kind of dealing, for instance, this
Yes.
is another kind of thing, because the European flag is really deeply uninspiring. It's blue and it has 12 stars, and it suggests that Europe is one. What we did here is a kind of barcode that starts with Ireland and it ends with Greece. And if Europe gets bigger, the barcode gets bigger. And so what it says, every one of us can recognize themselves in this, but still it's a larger whole. Yeah.
As you know, that there are a lot of people who worry about that it's important for people now to speak out about maintaining the transatlantic alliance.
Yeah.
That they worry, and I've had people in this country say to me, when I saw Chirac, Putin, Schroeder standing together, almost in opposition to the United States, it sent a shiver up my spine.
Yes,
Here. They worry about it. They worry about it for both sides. They worry about it because the history is so great. They worry about it because, not to be dramatic, but America has come to help
absolutely,
Europe
yes.
twice in a major way.
But actually, no one kind of forgets that nobody quarrels with that. I think that that kind of moment was really childish because it was
What was childish?
The moment of Putin, Chirac, and Schroeder. It was childish because it was in opposition. But I think that what we should all do is basically suspend the controversy for a moment, and work on what we're all involved in. And work on kind of repairing not so much the alliance, because I think the alliance is kind of unbelievably inevitable and robust, but to work on the kind of system and the ties that tie the whole world together.
Now, tell me one more time. We got to close this out. This came about because the European Union came to you and said, "Help us understand a visualization of what we hope to be."
I was part of a kind of group that helped them, and it seems that we will be continuing this kind of work.
So here in this magazine, Wired, Cool World, guest editor Rem Koolhaas presents the ultimate atlas for the 21st century, in which you talk primarily, and we don't have much time to spend on this, space.
Yeah.
And you also talk in an interesting way that the language of architecture may not be equipped
So that
to
is very true.
define the new way space works.
Yeah. Well, I think that this is an issue that I've conceptualized together with my office AMO, which is kind of the anti-architectural office, and with Michael Rock and Lucia Alet of 2x4. And what we try to do is to make an inventory of how globalization and politics influence space. Because there is an incredible confrontation of many cultures, and that means that almost any kind of architectural system is under enormous pressure, to accommodate events that it didn't accommodate before. And at the same time, we are also confronted with virtual space in a way that didn't exist and that has taken away something from real spaces. So in the past 20 years, I think that both through politics, globalization, and technology, the classical experiences of space have radically changed, and this is kind of a really preliminary investigation of how that works, or how that could work. For instance, there's one kind of moment there which I think is very interesting, that the only way in which it seems that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict can be organized or solved is to no longer interpret borders simply as two-dimensional, as lines on the map, but in a sectional, three-dimensional form, by tunnels and bridges, so that some sides can be both Palestinian and Israeli, and Palestinian on the ground, Israeli in the air, and underneath.
They actually got into that in terms of one of the settlements that they were working on in Camp David.
So the incredible complexity of that, that is something that has never existed in space, and architecture or planning have never been kind of even asked to deal with those kind of complexities. So on the one hand, you can see that a certain kind of architecture is eroding. On the other hand, that a certain kind of expectation of architecture is mutating, and that there is kind of from left field an enormous amount of new architectural experiences that appear out of nowhere. So it's really addressing the issue that somehow we have to find a repertoire and words to discuss those.
There were those who, is architecture up to this?
I used to think no, but I only recently found that architecture is, you can look at it in many different ways, as an incredibly old-fashioned profession with a 3,000-year-old history. But at the same time, we have to be formalist, we have to be reasonably artistic, we have to be political, we have to be economical. So it is also a profession that covers an incredible vastness of different and sometimes kind of contradictory sciences or knowledges, for systems of knowledge. And I think that basically the width is what in the current circumstances may save architecture, because I think it's one of the few disciplines that still cultivates that width, and it still teaches that width, and that is still based on that.
I'm out of time. The good news is you're going to stay in New York, and you're not abandoning. The second good news is that through this, whether you are thinking about the future, both in terms of architecture, but also in terms of political ideas and giving visualization to them. And the other good news, it's always a great pleasure to have you on this program.
Thank you.
Very good. Rem Koolhaas, let me remind people to look for Wired, because you will see a lot of the ideas expressed in that magazine soon out, in which the guest editor was Rem Koolhaas. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.